When I became pastor at Sun Lakes United Church of Christ over 10 years ago, I decided to use the Revised Common Lectionary for our Sunday readings. One reason was I was perhaps just a little lazy in trying to come up every week with a scripture text to preach on. The Revised Common Lectionary afforded me the opportunity to have a text already chosen for each Sunday. It's following the Hebrew Scripture, the Old Testament, in the first reading, a reading from the letter of Paul, or one of the letters of Paul, and then the Gospel. Remember, it's a 3-year cycle of readings. Cycle A, we follow the Gospel of Matthew, which we are in at the present moment. Cycle B follows the Gospel of Mark, and Cycle C follows the Gospel of Luke. Texts from the Gospel of John are interspersed throughout the year. So in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, we've been following the story up to this point of the family of Abraham and Sarah, and most particularly Isaac's son, Jacob. Jacob has had his ups and downs. He's had positive moments and very negative moments. But where we pick up the story of Jacob today is in his old age. He settled back in his home country, and he is celebrating the life of his sons. He has 12 sons. Joseph, who is the first son of his most loved wife, Rachel, and Benjamin, his youngest son, from his wife, Rachel. Today, what seems to happen is that Joseph has been showered with special gifts. Remember, it's the multicolored coat that his father gives to him. His brothers become jealous of him because of him being favored, or how they perceive it, him being favored by his father Jacob. Well, of course, that just makes sense. Joseph was the son of his most loved wife, Rachel. Of course, it would seem that he would get the favored position in the family. But hidden in this story, of course, is the transition that will happen with Joseph. That Joseph will be the one who will, as we will hear over the next few weeks, who will be the one who will end up in Egypt and will ultimately be the one who will save his brothers. But today, the jealousy of his brothers leads them to want to do away with him, want to kill him. And so they throw him in the pit where they hope that he will die out in the heat of the desert. But lo and behold, a caravan comes by and they sell him off to the caravan, and Joseph is saved, and that's where we leave the story. Today, Joseph is the one who becomes instrumental in this whole larger narrative, not any longer just about Abraham and Sarah and their family, but the larger narrative of the people of Israel. And we will see how this unfolds over the next few weeks. In the gospel narrative, as I suggested, that the life and ministry of Jesus begins with his announcing that the reign of God is at hand. And then we see various moments and incidences and events in his life as he journeys around Galilee, preaching and teaching about the reign of God. There are a variety of miracles that occur. And again, remember, we can look at the miracle as just about the display of power, or we can look at the miracle as a evidence, a sign of the reign of God, the presence of the reign of God. So every time that there is a healing, every time that someone receives sight, every time that someone who is broken becomes made whole again, this is the activity of the reign of God, and that's what we need to always keep in mind. We spent several weeks listening to various images and metaphors in the parables of Jesus, where again the conclusion that can be drawn is that the reign of God is not about scarcity, that the presence of God is not a little, but the presence of God is fantastic, is unimaginable, if you will. And yes, last week we heard the story of Jesus taking a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish and distributing them to the thousands that have gathered to listen to him, to be present with him. And I suggested at that time that, again, it's not so much about the miracle, the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes, but it's about the way that this miracle symbolizes the great abundance of life in the reign of God. Well, today, and one of the features in Galilee that plays a prominent role in the life and ministry of Jesus is the Lake of Galilee. And let me tell you, every time that I've gone there, like last October when I went with a group of people on pilgrimage to Palestine and to the biblical sites in Israel, that I'm always stand in awe at the Lake of Galilee. And I'll post some pictures after I post this video of what the Lake of Galilee looks like. It's probably one of the few places left today in modern Israel where when you stand on the shore of the Lake of Galilee, you have the same vision of Jesus. It looks the same. The lake, the hills that look over from Jordan. This is where Jesus' life took place, around this lake. Most of the stories take place in Galilee and around this lake. And so what happens is, as the gospel writer is telling the story of Jesus, that Jesus frequently is mentioned as getting into the boat. One, he gets into the boat in order to teach those thousands on the hillside. And then he goes across the Lake of Galilee to preach and teach there, not much, but a little bit, and then comes back across the lake. One thing to keep in mind is that historically, the far shore of the Lake of Galilee was considered to be pagan territory or Gentile territory. And so the gospel suggests, as the Gospel of Mark originally told these stories, is that Jesus' ministry, while always for the house of Israel, the Jewish side of the lake, that it did seem that he managed to cross the lake into Gentile territory or pagan territory and also preach there. Again, the suggestion is that the reign of God is not exclusive to one community of people, but the reign of God is inclusive of all people. It has a universal message to it, a universal appeal, if you will. And so the preaching of Jesus on the other side of the lake, on Gentile territory, whether that was a historical remembrance from Jesus' time or whether it's Matthew's community, because remember, Matthew's community is struggling with the influx of Gentiles into their community. And they're struggling with it because they had long believed in the tradition that they, as the Jewish people, were the chosen people. How is it possible that we should welcome and embrace Gentiles without expecting them to convert to Judaism? Because that was not happening. They joined the faith community of Jesus without needing to become Gentiles. That's the argument of Paul a couple of generations before this gospel. So in any event, as I've stood at the Lake of Galilee and tried to imagine this gospel story today, I go, how is this possible? How is it possible that this lake that you can see across, how is it possible that it would have such a tremendous storm on it that waves would almost crash over the sides of the boat? And I've always wondered about that. And one of my pilgrimages to Israel, there was a tremendous windstorm. And what you need to imagine is that the Lake of Galilee is a part of the Great Rift Valley that starts in Syria and goes down through the middle of Palestine, all the way down into Africa, actually. And so the Lake of Galilee is over 800 feet below sea level. And so the wind from Syria comes down this valley over across the lake. And so you could actually imagine, I had that opportunity one time standing there on the lake. The wind was like 30 or 40 miles an hour. And while the waves weren't huge waves like you would see in an ocean surf, but they were high enough that you could imagine a small boat out in the middle of the lake would not have much chance of surviving. And one thing to again keep in mind about the boat, and I may try to find a picture of a first century boat that they did discover along the lake shore, that the sides of the boat were not 3 or 4 feet above the water level. They were maybe barely a foot above the water level. And the reason was because when you cast your net out into the lake to gather in the fish, that you didn't want to have to lift them up and over the side of the boat. You just wanted to drag it in from the water into the side of the boat. So the side of the boat had to be not much above waterline. And so you could again imagine, I believe that day that I saw this, that there were maybe 1 or 2 foot high waves on the lake. It was a very rough surf out on the lake. And so I could just imagine this story being a real story. Fishermen, Jesus and his disciples are crossing from one side of the lake to the other, and one of these great windstorms comes up, and the boat is being tossed and turned. And as the story unfolds, it's really a fascinating story. That Jesus is so calm throughout this story. He's in the brow of the boat and he's just snoozing away, and the disciples are in the middle of a panic and they're saying to one another, what's going to happen? We're going to drown. Doesn't he care about us? And so they disturb Jesus enough with their loud talking that he gets up. And seemingly the focus is on the miracle again. He calms the waters and they stand in awe and wonderment. Who is this? That even the waves of the water pay attention to him and are obedient to him. And again, the whole image here is, if we transport ourselves from Jesus' time even to the gospel writer's time, that if you could imagine the boat being the community of faith, or later writers would say the boat represents the church, that the church is in the middle of this vast lake of the world, and it often gets tossed and turned by terrible storms, persecutions, and threats of destruction. And yet the story suggests that in the reign of God, those who are in the boat, not just literally, but those who are in the community, that even though the storms and the turmoils will rage outside of them, that God is very much present in their midst. And here God's presence is seen in Jesus himself. And in this story then, as it unfolds, as it comes to another event of crossing the lake, that Jesus appears walking across the lake. The disciples are again out into the boat. And as they're crossing the lake, they see Jesus. And as they come closer, Jesus is standing on the lake and he calls to Peter, Peter, come out to me. And Peter's like, what? How can we ever think about getting out of this boat in the middle of the lake? I'll drown, he says. And Jesus says, Peter, Peter, what little faith you have. If I've suggested to you that you can do this, you can walk across the lake to me, then it must mean that I see in you a great deal of faith. And that becomes the issue, right? The issue for Peter is, do I have faith enough to believe in Jesus that even crossing the lake is not an obstacle to following him, but becomes an opportunity to learn more about him and to become more like him in a sense? That as Peter finally gets out of the boat, whether he actually believes he has the faith to do it or not doesn't matter. But he gets out of the boat and of course he sinks. And Jesus grasps his hand and there's one of those images again. Almost every miracle has something to do with Jesus touching or grasping the hand of the one who's in need. And so Jesus grasps the hand of Peter and lifts him up. And Peter manages to stand next to Jesus on the lake. They're still all in awe about this and what's going on with this story. So I want to think about it, both in terms of the Old Testament reading about Jacob and his son Joseph and Joseph's brothers, and this story in the gospel today. A couple of things to consider. That jealousy and fear and anxiety over the future are enemies of faith. That fear doesn't come from the confidence that I have in the power and the presence of either my own ability, let alone the power and presence of God in my life, but fear and anxiety about the future. Where are we going? What are we doing? I'm there. Sometimes I'm very anxious about the future because I want to have something definitive. I want something concrete to hold on to. I want something that's going to give me confidence because I can see it, not just know it, but I can see it in a way that enables me to move forward. You know, in this time of the pandemic, I'm not sure that's possible for us. I'm sure all of us over the past 3 months, wow, I just wish we'd get back to the norm. I just wish it would get normal again, whatever that meant to begin with. But I have to say, I'm not sure what it's going to mean much more in the future. What is that going to mean for us? The norm. What is the norm going to be? How is it going to be normal again, ever again? I really am not sure at this point that it's ever going to be normal again. This will be with us for a long time, and especially those of us 65 and over, it may be with us for the rest of our lives. Maybe our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren that are just beginning their journey in life, maybe it will be controlled. I think back, I've often been telling the story about vaccines, and I remember when I was a kid, and you all remember, I've asked several of you as parents, that when I was a kid, they lined us up and we all got the polio vaccine. Remember that? We didn't have a choice because they knew that if we were to end childhood polio, that everybody had to be vaccinated for that. And I recently read a story that in that first year after that, that only 50% of the children who had been vaccinated was it effective. And not until the second year was it 80% effective, meaning that 80% of the people who had been vaccinated actually avoided getting polio, but 20% seemed to have gotten it. And did you know that it wasn't until 1979 that polio was eradicated in the United States? So by analogy, I have to think, is it going to be that once we get a vaccine that we won't have to worry about COVID-19 anymore? I doubt it. So let me try to suggest this, looking back to this story of Joseph. His brothers are very anxious about their future because they keep believing that they control their destiny. And if anything in this story of Abraham and Sarah's family tells us that we don't control our destiny, is that story of Joseph. The future of this family is in the hands of Joseph, and the uncertainty that is there, that means that he has to keep trusting God. And I don't want it just to be about that, because that's almost too trivial in a way. Trust God and everything will be okay. No, because the expectation, and here's where you move to the gospel. You can trust God, but God expects you to also be doing something. That's the story of Peter. Jesus says, this is what it's about, folks. You said you're my disciple, so let's see if you're going to trust enough in the faith that you have in me that you can accomplish and do something that you just think is totally bizarre, totally ridiculous. Get out of that boat and walk across the water to me. Let's see if you can trust enough in yourself and in your own faith that you will do this. And so the suggestion is that it's not only about trusting God, but it's trusting our abilities, trusting our ability to reason and think critically, and our ability to look at the world around us and to make sense of it, even when it's not possible that we really can make sense of it, that we won't get answers to all the questions that we have. Oh, you of little faith, Jesus says. Well, what does that mean? It's not faith in beliefs and dogmas and doctrines. It's faith and belief, one, yes, in God, but also faith and belief that God has given us the capabilities, the strengths, the possibilities to do what we need to do, not only to continue our discipleship, but God has given us the abilities to put on masks when we know that that's what we need to do, to social distance when we know that that's what we need to do. Sometimes I just wish that there'd be a little bit more direction on how to deal with self-isolation and being alone in the house, as I'm sure that some of you are, that seeing four walls can drive you a little crazy after a while. And watching TV, well, that just drives me crazy now with all the political ads. So how do we do this? How do we do this? Just thinking about it right now, we do this because we're all there. We're just like all the disciples in the boat. We're all in the boat together. And it's tossing us and turning us in ways that we would never have imagined 5 months ago. Who would have ever imagined this? The boat's being tossed and turned. Our world is being tossed and turned. And sometimes it just seems that God's asleep. Jesus is asleep. Why aren't you going to do something about this? And Jesus comes walking calmly across the water in another one of the boat stories and says, you can do this. You can do this because you have the power and the ability in you. That's what faith ultimately is. To step out of the boat and walk across the lake to me. We can step out of our comfort zone. We've been forced to already do that, right? We can step out of our comfort zone and see the world differently. Remember, that's what the parables suggested. We can see the world differently through the lens of the reign of God. We're tossed and turned in the boat, but through the lens of the reign of God, we know that we will survive, and ultimately we will thrive and prosper as human beings. Not prosper economically, but prosper as human beings. The fullness of our humanity, that's where the prospering will take place, because the reign of God is inside of us, transforming and changing us, making us stronger, more ready to look at the world in different ways. I pray that God will continue to bless you today. It's really hot out here in Arizona, so please stay cool, well hydrated, stay safe, be healthy. Please be healthy. Make wise and smart choices for yourself and your families, as I try to make wise and choices for me and my family. Many blessings be with you today. Be at peace, be cool, stay calm in faith, and remember, where's the reign of God happening in your life?